Hello, introductory public speaking. Professor Carr here to talk about Chapter 4, Effective Listening. Listening is an important skill that you can learn. Why is it important? Well, there are several reasons why it's important that we're going to outline in our chapter. First, realize the benefits of effective listening. That's our first objective. 2, understand the process of listening. Listening is a process. It doesn't come all at once. It rolls out in a series of steps. 3, overcome the barriers to listening. We have all sorts of distractions, whether they're external, like noise outside, or whether they're internal, like personal issues that we may have, or maybe we're hungry, or maybe something's wrong with the temperature in the room. 4, improve critical listening skills. There are some techniques that we can use to become more effective listeners that we can learn in this chapter. 5, evaluate messages. Learn how to process what you are hearing and discern whether it is based on fact or emotion. And number 6, become an ethical listener. Learn how to listen to hear the message, not so much the messenger. Our chapter opens with a quote. It simply says, "Know how to listen, and you will be able to listen to those who speak badly." Plutarch, who's from the ancient Greek world. In this world, we have to do a lot of listening. And quite frankly, there are some people that we really don't want to listen to. Even though we need to hear their message, it's difficult for us to listen to. Maybe it's a college professor. Maybe the college professor has a very intense dialect. Maybe they're from the South, or maybe they have an accent. Maybe they're from a foreign country, and you have a difficult time discerning what they're saying. We can learn these techniques to become more effective, and to be ethical is not to be offensive to individuals. So the first point we're going to look at are the benefits of effective listening. How can listening affect us, and how can it be beneficial? First place, listening in the classroom. Let's take a look. Listen to this scenario. It's a warm spring day. Carla's body is in her management class, but her mind is somewhere else. Sound familiar? Her instructor's voice drones on, but the words don't register until he says, "Carla, I know you've worked in this kind of environment. Tell us what it was like." If you've ever lived through this kind of nightmare, you already know how important listening is in the classroom. There's nothing worse than we're in a conversation or the professor is giving a lecture and maybe something else is on our mind. That is a barrier to listening. That's what's called an internal distraction. Carla's mind was elsewhere. Even though she was physically in the room, her mind had wandered. Now, the dangerous intersection is if the professor calls on you and your mind is wandering, that could be a very embarrassing situation. But where else is listening important? Well, listening is important in the workplace. If you become a more effective listener in the workplace, number 1, you can impress your superiors, your supervisor, your manager, your boss. You can also work well with coworkers because they feel valued because you are listening to them. And probably the most important aspect of being an effective listener in the workplace is job promotion. Those who tend to get promoted tend to be good listeners, follow instructions, and do what they're supposed to do. And the last place that listening can be very effective is in our personal relationships. Sometimes we take our friends and family for granted by not listening to them. Sometimes we're distracted by our phones, or we may be distracted by other thoughts, and we do what's called pseudo listening. We do that on the phone. And my favorite one that we do that sounds really stylish is, yeah. That's not listening. Listening is focusing on what the person is saying and valuing what they are trying to communicate to you. You give them your undivided attention. Later on in the chapter, we're going to look at the Chinese symbol for listening, and you will see how amazingly important it is for us to not only listen with our ears, but listen with our eyes, listen with our hearts, to listen with our whole selves. So we'll continue to talk about effective listening. The next step we want to talk about is understanding listening. We need to have a definition of what listening really is. We have to distinguish the difference between hearing and listening. For example, you're watching this video. You can hear my voice. You may be able to hear some of the sounds in this room echoing as I am having this conversation with you. However, it's not until you ascribe meaning to what I'm saying are you listening. So what's the difference between hearing and listening? Hearing is involuntary. We are passive when we hear things. We can hear noises but not ascribe meaning to them. So in essence, listening is voluntary. It is also active because we actively ascribe meaning to the sounds that we hear. So they're not just arbitrary. Amy Kossoff-Smith, in an article titled, "Are You a Bad Listener?" in Chicago Tribune, states, and I quote, "Although we spend most of our communication time listening to others speak, we receive far less formal training in listening than we do in speaking, writing, or reading. Perhaps educators assume that we are born knowing how to listen. Also, listening may be undervalued in the mainstream U.S. culture because it is typically associated with following rather than leading. Leadership is typically more admired than, quote, followership. But being able to listen effectively increases one's ability to understand and solve problems, key ingredients of leadership. Fortunately, this vital but sometimes neglected skill can be improved. Hearing problems can be remedied by medical or technical intervention. Listening efficiency can be increased through training. Improved listening begins with understanding the different types of listening that are engaged in different situations. The major types of listening important in public communication include the following. 1, comprehensive listening involves being able to distinguish and interpret the words in a message and to pick up on nonverbal cues that affect the meaning. Second one is critical listening. It adds an evaluative dimension to the comprehension of a message. It involves many of the same skills used in critical thinking, centering on whether statements are justified by adequate evidence. And third, empathic listening moves beyond recognizing the rationality of a speech to consider the human and humane aspects of a message. Is what we were talking about in the last video, that when we learn to listen with empathic listening, we start to listen to the human being. We listen to not only what they're saying, we listen to their body language, we read their eyes, we listen to the sound of their voice, and we listen with our hearts. So as we look at comprehensive listening, listening that focuses on understanding and interpreting the verbal and nonverbal aspects of a message. So when we listen comprehensively, we're looking to understand or to comprehend. We want to get the main point of the message. Now with critical listening are for skeptical listeners. Critical listeners listen for information that is correct, that is credible, authorities that are reliable, and if there is something missing, we point it out because we've listened critically. We also look for logical fallacies when we're doing critical listening, which will come more into effect when we do persuasive speaking. So critical listening that carefully evaluates a message. A second function of critical listening involves understanding in the ways in which pleasing language or charismatic speaker can beguile us into accepting without actually evaluating them. For example, we may get caught up in the beauty of the language, the grace of the delivery, or the personality of the speaker, and we don't critically evaluate what they are saying. People such as cult leaders or even corrupt political leaders can possibly use this to deceive, to misinform, and to misguide those who are following them. Empathic listening is what we discussed before. It involves the human element. We want to be able to listen to someone so that they feel valued. Because, let's face it, we want to be listened to because we think what we have to say is very valuable. That's why it makes it equally important for those to learn how to listen well so that we too can be valued in the speaking and the listening process. Again, empathic listening is such as this: listening that goes beyond rationality to consider the human and humane aspects of a message. So we have comprehensive listening. We also have critical listening. We have empathic listening. Learn how to master all three in different circumstances, in different contexts, in different environments. If we take into account these three types of listening, we'll be on our way to being more effective listeners.